Welcome to Ordinary People Doing Extraordinary Things, the podcast show. I am your host, Carrie Roberts, and I have, again, yet another extraordinary person. I have Mr. Craig Kessler. He is the Chief Operating Officer at Topgolf, an author, and also a dad to 3 sons. So welcome. I'm so excited to have you here, Craig.
Carrie, thanks for having me, and I'm excited to spend time with you.
Yeah, so before we get into your new book, I would love to ask, our whole talk today is a little bit more about fatherhood. And I'd love to start off with you when you were a kid. What were some of your memories with your dad, or what are the things that you remember your dad teaching you either as a child or later on in life?
Yeah, I had a good childhood for all intents and purposes. I had a loving sister. I had a mom and a dad. We grew up in San Diego and had a normal childhood, played a bunch of sports. And, I think if I go back and think about what my dad in particular taught me, it was how to think big. He is a wildly creative man, spent a lot of time in the music business and was constantly pushing the envelope and finding new creative solutions to ordinary problems. And that's a skill I've benefited from.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense, especially the type of work you do now. When you were young, I always feel like it's different for men than for women, but I'm curious for you. Did you imagine yourself having a family and being a dad? Was that always in the back of your mind, or was that something that you were like, I'll get to later, maybe it'll happen?
I think I'd be lying if I told you I had an answer to that question. I don't remember the moment where I thought I should be a dad. But what I do remember is at some point in my life having the feeling of, man, I would love to coach my kids' t-ball team, and I would love to be part of a community that's bigger than just myself. But when that started, honestly, I couldn't tell you. And
so you have 3 boys. How old are they?
We're in the thick of it, Carrie. My wife and I have 3 boys, 1, 3, and 5, and the energy levels in our house, you can imagine, they're off the charts.
Yes, I have friends. I do not have children myself, but I have friends of that age, and it's just like constant, a lot of stuff going on, so I can only imagine. When did you, so like you said, you didn't really think about, becoming a father. When did you first feel like, okay, I'm a father? Was it when you found out your wife was pregnant, when you held your son in your arms? When was that moment for you?
That's an awesome question. I actually don't know if anyone's ever asked me that before. I think if I reflect back, there have been a series of defining moments that built upon one another as opposed to having a singular moment where I felt like a dad. So when my wife told me she was pregnant, that is probably the most powerful statement I've ever heard, and I'll never forget that feeling. When our first Ryan was born, I wept for 2 days straight. I just couldn't believe that this little man that we created was in my arms, and it had all kinds of feelings wrapped up in it. But what's interesting is I would say with time, the move from father to dad has evolved dramatically as the kids got older. I was a father from somewhere between when I found out she was pregnant until the baby was born, but it became a dad as I built a real connection with my son, and we play games together and experiment with things in the backyard and play sports and all that. And I think the combination of all those things happening over time is what's made me feel like a dad.
And you kind of use the word father and dad. Is there a difference between those 2 words for you?
There wasn't until I started the Dad Advice Project, which I know we're going to talk more about in a minute, but a bunch of my buddies have pointed out this distinction, which is, and maybe I'm using the words backwards, but the way they've pointed it out is you become a father the second you bring life into this world, but you become a dad once you actually do something productive and shepherd that little human to the next phase of life. And I like to think of myself as a dad as opposed to a serious father.
Yeah, I like that definition a lot. I think you're correct. I would probably agree with how that was stated as well. So, you have 3 kids. Again, we're going to get to the book, but I wanted to talk about you as a dad for a moment. Did you seek out advice in the form of books or your own father or friends at any point, either before or after?
I am constantly seeking out advice on being a dad, and that will never stop. Candidly, I think the best places where I found advice are from other guys who I have respect and admiration for. In terms of content, there's some content out there, but the content for dads is a fraction of what it is for moms. And the quality, it's interesting. Most dads don't like being lectured. And I find that most of the content out there is written by one person who tells you how to be a good dad. And so I had a hard time relating to that. And again, I know we'll get to the book in a minute, but this idea of crowdsourcing advice from a lot of people seems interesting to me. I'll give you one quick analogy too, by the way. If you're sick, you probably go to the doctor as opposed to typing your symptoms into a website. And you do it primarily because a doctor has seen 10,000 cases just like yours and has pattern recognition. What's interesting to me about parenting is that each time as a dad I face something new and challenging, it's the first time I've faced it. And so I don't have pattern recognition. But the idea of, to your question, asking advice from lots of different folks and helping to develop that pattern recognition early, I actually think has helped me in a ton of ways.
And do you think that, again, I don't have any kids, but I'm the oldest of three, and I look at my siblings and we have the same core values, but we're very different in personalities and interests and everything. Do you notice that with your own kids, and how do you parent them maybe a little bit differently?
It's a great question, and one that I talk a lot about with friends of mine who have much older kids and have been through the different stages of life. As you know, our youngest is 1, our oldest is 5, the middle guy is 3. So while there are differences, they're still pretty small because the kids are so young. That said, our oldest is wildly creative and would build and create and draw all day long if we let him. Our middle kid just wants to beat up his older brother and younger brother and play sports all day long. And so what I can anticipate happening is trying to figure out 2 things. Number one, how do I tease out the passions and skills and gaps and weaknesses from each of my kids? And then number 2 is, therefore, what do I do about it? And I'm, again, still in the early days, but I can tell already that those 2 things will become important.
And so you have this new book that has come out, the Dad Advice Project. And we had mentioned that you are a top level at Topgolf for a long time. What made you decide to say, okay, I'm going to write a book, but I wanted to focus on fatherhood versus maybe something that's in business or sports?
The truth is I never planned to write a book. Candidly, and to be vulnerable for a second, I don't have the closest relationship with my dad today. And that's been a huge bummer for a bunch of reasons. Not having a sounding board is at the top of that list. And so, inspired by filling that void in my life, and also inspired by a couple other things, about 2.5 years ago, I asked a few buddies to just write me a letter on how to be a good dad. And what I got back ranged from David Letterman style top 10 lists that were funny but thoughtful, to letters they wrote their kids and everything in between. And in the last 2.5 years, this thing just snowballed, and it became the Dad Advice Project with 40 letters written from all kinds of guys. And, eventually we turned it into a book.
And you had, like you said, the way the book is kind of laid out, it is all these kind of different stories you have about 40 people. You had one that I liked. It was Dale Petrosky. He's the president CEO of the Dallas Region Chamber, former president of National Baseball Hall of Fame, senior vice president of National Geographic, and assistant White House secretary to President Ronald Reagan. That's a pretty intense resume there. And he said that one of his best friends told him something that was pretty profound and stuck with him. And he said, we're not raising children, we're raising the parents of our grandchildren. In other words, in every action as a parent, know that you are teaching for the long term, not just for today. When you heard that or you read that, what did that mean to you? And have you thought about that in the way you parent?
100%. It's funny. We've got this I don't know, 150, 175 page book with 42 submissions from all kinds of interesting people. And the quotation that gets cited more than any other is, I think, the one that you just shared from
Oh,
Dale.
really?
Oh, totally. Totally. Not only because Dale's such an amazing guy, but also because I think it's such a profound comment that he
Yeah.
made. I actually think what he's saying applies to all walks of life. It applies to parenting, in business, in friendships. What he's effectively saying is we're playing the long game. Take a deep breath. Don't worry about every single short-term decision. Make sure that what you're doing over the long haul will make you proud. And by the way, one of the best ways to measure whether you're proud and whether you think you've done a quote good job is, do you love your grandkids? Because ultimately it's your kids who are raising them. So what a cool thought from Dale.
Yeah, no, I had never heard that before. And I was like, that's such a smart thing that he shared. I know you're not going to say your favorite, but as you looked at these and read these, was there one or two that really stood out to you, either like, oh, I never thought about that before, or that's really smart or really helpful?
It's interesting. There are pieces of advice that I would mention because I think they're so unique. But those pieces of advice didn't necessarily come from my favorite passages. I will tell you, and you're right, I don't have favorites, but there are a couple that have struck me in really profound ways that I'll mention. One, the foreword to the book is written by my former college professor who was the head of the CIA on 9/11, a man by the name of George Tenet. And he's just an incredible man. And there's a line in Tenet's foreword where he says, I've met kings and queens, princes, princesses, heads of intelligence organizations, prime ministers and presidents, but none of those people compare to my dad. And my biggest regret in life was that he never got to see me become head of the CIA. And to think about the profoundness of what it means to be a dad, given all these people he had met in his life, just reminded me of, the gravitas of what it means to be a dad. So that was great. I think Davis Love III, former Ryder Cup captain, PGA Tour golfer, he talks about how his dad raised him on a golf course, not to be a golfer, but just to be a kid. And they'd go fishing in the ponds and they build sand castles in the sand traps. And as I think about raising my boys, wanting and hoping that they will love golf just like their dad does, it's a reminder for me that it's not about whether they hit the ball straight or far or even hit it at all at this young age. It's really about making sure they feel a sense of physical and psychological safety on the golf course. And when they're ready, they'll pick up a club and we'll go out and play together. And I think that lesson around psychological and physical safety is one that applies to so many walks of life, not just being a dad. And then the final one, there's a guy named John Spear. He's a former B-2 stealth bomber. And while a lot of guys have this really cool set of philosophical advice and storytelling that they do throughout their submission, John gets down to brass tacks and has like 10 or 12 super concrete, really tactical ideas, many of which we've already implemented in our family. And I think the readers will take a lot away from him.
So what do you say to a man who maybe, reads this book or looks to people around him and says, well, I don't have this great resume. I don't know these high level people, or maybe I don't have this amount of money. Maybe there's this feeling of like, am I a good enough man to be a good enough dad to my kid? What would be kind of your thoughts on that? Does that matter? Does it not? What really makes a good dad?
I'm in no position to give advice. I mean, I've been doing this for 5 years, right? It's why I asked friends to write me letters asking for advice, because I'm in no position to give it. Here's what I would say, though, to the dad that shares with me what you just shared. One of my favorite moments throughout this 2.5-year journey happened a few weeks ago when I finally got the physical book for the first time. And my wife, who loves reading, said, look, I'm not reading this thing until there's a physical book, because this is going to be such an emotional and cool day for me to sit down and open it up and read it cover to cover. So we did it. And When she finished, I said, what do you think? And she said, here's my first observation. She said, when moms read content on how to be better moms, 9 out of 10 times I finish reading the content and I feel less than. I feel ashamed because I'm not doing all these things that the authors told me I need to do in order to be a good mom. And yes, I learn, but I don't feel great about what I've done in the past. She said the cool thing about the Dad Advice Project, Craig, is that most of these guys are talking about mistakes they've made, things they've gotten wrong, lessons they've learned, as opposed to telling you what to do. And her big takeaway was that it inspired her to be a better person. And if you believe that in life, the best you can do is from this point forward, you can't change the past, but from this point forward, you can do wonderful things. I would say, like, cut yourself some slack, figure out where your gaps are, and from this point forward, just try your best.
It seems like a simple concept, but I think you're right. I think people in general, we're always thinking, okay, am I doing things enough? Am I enough? And I'm sure as parents, like I said, I don't have children, but I've talked to friends that there is this sometimes compare game or this advice that says you have to do this, you have to breastfeed your child and you can't work or you should work and all these things. And it's a lot of pressure on moms. Do you think that dads feel that pressure, or have you ever felt that type of pressure in any capacity?
Everybody feels it. Some are better at hiding it than others, but we all feel it in our own ways. I think, it's fascinating. I asked a bunch of working moms before we had our first boy for a piece of advice on parenting. And I did it, I think, in part because I wanted to be supportive of my wife, who has always been and will always be, I think, a working mom. And she works outside the home in addition to raising our kids. And what I learned from them, I would boil it down into 3 points. It's babies don't break, so chill. Like, if your kid gets sick or eats dirt, it'll be okay. The second point is try and be present, because you may only get to do this once in your life. But the third, and this speaks to, I think, what you're getting at, is try not to judge, and maybe you won't be judged in return, because I can guarantee you what works for your family doesn't work for mine, and vice versa. And one of my best friends, also a contributor to the book, Michael Glick, they took their baby, who was 3 days old, to the local diner and had breakfast and had a wonderful time as a family and felt great about it. We have some friends who waited 2.5 years before they, took their kids out of the house to do things other than doctor's appointments. So again, take a deep breath. Most people turn out just fine in the end, and the comparison game doesn't help.
Yes. No, I think that's a really good point. How would you say being a dad has changed you as a man?
I guess the question is, how hasn't it? I think about professional ambition in a different way than I used to, because now I'm as much motivated by getting home or to my kids' t-ball game as I am about professional things. I think about, everyone's always heard, actions speak louder than words, but boy, does that resonate with young kids more than I ever thought. My kids will try and replicate what I wear to work, what I eat, phrases that I use. And I just have to be really thoughtful, because back to Dale Petrosky's point about playing the long game, everything is, laying the foundation for a future. So I think it's affected me in an enormous number of ways.
Now, after having written this book, what is your plan for it? Do you see this being where you could hold, events or teachings or conversations, or is it just your way of saying, okay, here's a great book of advice for dads, because there are just not that many out there?
It's a question I've been asked a decent amount, and I wish I had a good answer for you. I didn't know I was going to put together a book with my buddies, and it sort of happened. I don't have a plan for what comes next, but something tells me something cool and impactful will come from this. A couple of weeks ago, almost all 42 of the authors came to Dallas, where we live, to meet each other for the first time, to have dinner together. We played golf, and it was unreal. The new friendships that were fostered, and the conversation about fatherhood across the generations. We had a 30-year-old dad and we had a 70-year-old dad. So it was it was very, very powerful. And what I've learned is that there is demand for content like this because all of us want to do our best and be the best father that we can. And if this book can help people have conversations, shift their mindsets, ask questions, be vulnerable, then we're doing something.
Yeah, and I think it's something that is not talked about a lot. So I love that you're bringing this to light and having these conversations, not only in the book, but in real life. If people want to get the book and they want to learn more, where's the best place to do that?
It's really easy. Go to Amazon.com, type in the Dad Advice Project. We also, if you want to learn more about the project, meet some of the authors, digitally and learn about their profiles. Heck, if you want to submit advice of your own or ask a question, just log on to dadadviceproject.com and everything you need is right there.
Perfect. And the last question I like to ask all of my guests, Craig, is what is one word or quote or mantra that you try to live by every single day?
So this is funny. Every day when we drop our kids off at school, we've got this little call and response thing that we do. I say, be, they say kind, I say have, they say fun, and then I say try your, and they say best. So I guess it's be kind, have fun, and try your best.
Oh, I love that. Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Craig, for sharing this side of you and really bringing, again, the advice that I think men are craving and need in just a way that's much more communal and less threatening than maybe things that are out there. So I'm excited to see what comes for you. And I thank you so much for being here.
Carrie, thanks for having me on. I really enjoyed spending time with you.